Um, Welcome. I'm Ellen Haskell, the Herman and Zelda Bernard Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies, Professor of Religious Studies, and Director of Jewish Studies at UNCG. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk and community introduction with artist-in-resident Shoshana Gugenheim Kedem. Shoshana is a social practice artist, Torah scribe, curator, and educator. Her work investigates Jewish questions of ritual practice, power, gender, and the intersections of the sacred with the mundane. Her many projects, past and present, include Or Hadash, which promotes ethical, sustainable parchment for Hebrew scribes, Women of the Book, an international collaboration of Jewish women artists that produce works for weekly Torah readings, and Desert Labyrinth, a collaborative realization of Jewish journeys celebrated during the holiday Shavuot. Her time with us will culminate early this spring in the Greensboro Contemporary Jewish Museum, a pop-up featuring significant objects and oral histories from Greensboro's Jewish community. A catalog will accompany the exhibition. Our opportunity to learn from Shoshana tonight is brought to you by UNCG's Jewish Studies Program, Religious Studies Department, and College of Visual and Performing Arts with generous support from the Herman and Zelda Bernard Distinguished Professorship in Jewish Studies, the Henry Samuel Levinson Program Endowment for Jewish Studies, the Barbara Kolchemira Endowment, and the Judith Rosenstock Hyman Jewish Studies Program Endowment. And without further ado from me, Shoshana.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everybody. It's good to have been able to actually get here. I want to start with thank yous, just to sort of set the tone of gratitude and appreciation. And I really want to thank the Religious Studies Department and Ellen Haskell and Greg Greaves for reaching out and inviting me to come and do this project. And I want to thank Christina Joyner, who's been like a major player in helping to do all of the logistics around that. Adam Carlin from I want to get this right, the College of Visual and Performing Arts, also a friend of mine, and I don't know what your position is here, but I guess the director, of GPS of this amazing space, which I've been hearing about for years, and I'm really, really grateful to be here in this space. And the Greensboro Jewish community that already has stepped up and been so welcoming, and people who have started to offer their stories for this project, which we're going to learn more about. And also just a shout out to my family, my husband, really, who made it possible by staying home with our young children for me to be here for this time. So thanks, Andrew. Okay. So Chutzpah as art practice, this is what we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at tonight. And I actually want to start, there's a lot of ancestral work that's I'm gonna share with you in this space. And so I want to start with some other kind of ancestral work, and that is just by recognizing the land that we're on and who this land originally belonged to and was occupied by people who were living on this land. The Eno, the Sapani, the Catawba, the Shakori territories that once made up this Greensboro space. So I would really now, I'm going to share with you my name, and then I'm going to ask you to share with each other just a little bit, just to find out who you are. So my name is Shoshana Bat Nadia Livana, Bat Esther, Bat Penina, Bat Anna. So I'm the daughter of Nadia Livana, who is my mother, who is the daughter of Penina, who is the daughter of Esther, who is the daughter of Anna. That is who I am. That is my namesake. So I just wanted to ask you if you can just turn to your neighbor and just share your name and where you're from and what brought you here tonight. Okay, we're going to come back together. Lots to share about your names and why you're here. Come on in. Okay, we're going to come back together. Great, thanks. It's always nice to know who you're sitting next to and a little bit about them. And we're gonna, towards the end, we're gonna spend a little bit more time talking to our neighbors, so you'll have another chance. So what is chutzpah? I've been thinking a lot about chutzpah, which, well, actually I'll ask you guys, what is chutzpah? Nerve, guts. It's like being able to like come to a city that you were once visited 30 years ago and start a Jewish museum. It's like that a little bit. So I've been thinking a lot about what that means and chutzpah in that context. And then also because I was thinking about that like feeling of coming to this place, and again, I'll talk more about that. So I was also thinking about the chutzpah, a lot of where chutzpah shows up in my own work. And you'll see that. But I was thinking about chutzpah. Chutzpah is writing a traditional Torah scroll when you're a woman who's been forbidden to do that for 3,000 years or more. It's asking an all-female cast from the vagina monologues if you can body cast their naked bodies and hang sculptures in the theater lobby. It's taking the words of the mezuzah scroll and instead of writing them in tiny letters, inscribing them, carving them into wood and putting them around the doorway. It's making a talit out of your daughter's baby wrap. It's reclaiming Jewess as a term for Jewish women, as a means of like subverting this binary that we're moving away from. Chutzpah is assigning a reading to a group of art students and Jewish studies students in the former antebellum South on anti-Jewish oppression. It's like that was like a very chutzpah-dic thing for me to do, to ask all those students to really like dig deeply into some understanding of what anti-Jewish oppression looks like. And it's deciding to create and curate an international project of 54 Jewish women artists from 12 different countries over 10 years. It's opening a branch of the Guggenheim Museum in Portland, Oregon, because I bear the name Guggenheim and I can just do that. And it's opening a Jewish museum here because it's opening a Jewish museum where hasn't been a Jewish museum before here in Greensboro. So there's a lot of this chutzpah-dic pattern happening in a lot of my work. Okay, great. So I want to read a text to you. I want to also start by saying this is going to be a journey. I'm going to take you back through the arc of my work and my journey back into my ancestral heritage and the way in which I found my place there and how that has led me back to North Carolina and to this very place and why that is so significant for me to be here doing the work that I'm doing in North Carolina specifically. So just bear with me and we'll stop and breathe in between because it's a lot to take in. So the Torah given to Moshe, to Moses, was written with black fire upon white fire, sealed with fire, and swathed with bands of fire. From this understanding of the sacred fire, we learn that the Torah and the teachings within are infinite, interpretive, and only partially revealed. We will spend the rest of our lives finding and making meaning in the hidden and the revealed, for there is as much text to be interpreted in the white fire, the spaces between the black letters, as there is within the letters and the words themselves. Some scholars teach that it is in this white space this primordial Torah to which we need to return when more meaning is sought, when the hidden needs to be revealed, when the male-centric language of our tradition, of the Jewish tradition, becomes unbearable. And from there, within white fire, we extract new meaning and undo the erasures, if only the slightest bit. So I just wanted to set a context of where where this work is emerging from, this understanding of the fire. So there are some terms that I want to open with. And no, typically I would stand up and point to them. I'm not going to do that right now. So on the top is the word ivri, which is a Jew, a Jewish person. Oh, did it go? Oh, it went backwards. Sorry, the middle one is completely backwards. It's ivri'a, and it's the female version of Jew, meaning a Jewish woman. And ivrit, oh, I'm really bummed that it's okay. And ivrit is the Hebrew language. And you can see that they all share, except it's hard to tell because this one is backwards. But they do, I promise you, all share the same root, the ayin, the vet, and the resh. The first three letters on top appear in all three. But there is another meaning of ivri and ivri'a, and that is a boundary crosser. Because la'avor in Hebrew is to cross a boundary. And and I think about that space as the borderland. And that language is borrowed from Gloria Anzaldúa, whose book, Borderland, La Frontera, deeply takes a really deep dive into this understanding of what it means to exist in a borderland, in a space, in this like liminal space, where actually, perhaps in my case, even in your own diaspora, you don't, it's like a diaspora and a diaspora. So being a Jewish woman, for me, because of the way that I come to my Judaism, I've existed, and also living in Israel for many years, I've sort of existed in this liminal space, neither here nor there, like an unbelonging to either space. And there's going to be terms borrowing from the way that Anzaldúa worked with this idea of the borderland. She herself was Latina, and she, in this like very, very important piece of work that she wrote, included, a lot of it is written in Spanish, but there's just a way in which the Spanish appears, and you either integrate it because you understand it or you don't. But it's okay because you just have to wrestle with someone else's existence and the way that they move through the world. And so there'll be some Hebrew here, and I won't always translate it, and I won't always translate it or make it clear. It's just a doorway into where I exist in my world, and maybe you'll understand all of that, and maybe you won't, and it's okay to sit with a little bit of that discomfort or confusion. So I invite you just to relax into it. So this white space, like we were talking about, that white space in between the letters, that white fire, that's the space of possibility. It's the borderland, it's like this boundary, it's a space in between. And that's the space where my work has been consistently inserting itself. And so that's the space from which the new narrative emerges. So just a little bit of my history. These are my grandparents on my mother's side. Their parents both came from Russia, and they had a very traditional home. And my mom grew up in a semi-traditional home. And my grandmother, and I realize I didn't include my paternal grandfather here, but it's very focused on women. So my maternal grandmother, she would consistently say, "I'm not Jewish, I'm a Jewess." And this was really, and it wasn't until many, many, many years later that I really came to understand that that was her way of distancing herself from her identity, from being a Jewish woman as a tactic to assimilate. If she was a Jewess, she could move herself back a little bit. And by doing that, she could also afford to have a white Christmas tree with blue bells in the house. So every Christmas, she and my grandfather would pull out their white Christmas tree from the attic and hang these blue bells on it. And it was only recently that I thought, well, I don't know if she ever thought about how much it parallels the Israeli flag. But that was those were the worlds that we were existing in. And I grew up in a home that was very assimilated. We had affiliation with the synagogue, with a temple, and we lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. And that's where I was bat mitzvahed. And then a huge shift happened, and we moved to North Carolina. And in North Carolina, and that's me, the second one from the end in the back row. In North Carolina, my existence there was being othered. It was the first time that I started to experience being othered and really making this division between my two lives. My life at school, where I was really, really working hard to shed my Jewish identity and to just integrate and to do what everyone was doing and be popular and do all those things. And then my other life that was very, very involved in a Jewish youth group. And an amazing thing happened about 10 years ago in Jerusalem, and I was super involved in youth group, and that's what really that's what saved me, and that's what helped keep me Jewish, I think, because pretty much everybody else in my family has really walked away. And so I'm going to finish the Jerusalem story. We ended up, this is where had been living with my family until 3 years ago in this beautiful area in Israel. And I really needed to go back to Israel I needed to go on this very deep ancestral journey. The thing that happened in Israel about 10 years ago, I was sitting, I have some Arab friends who work in the Arab shuk. They're third generation garment distributors, buyers and distributors. And I've been doing some work with them, and I was sitting there, and some folks walked in, and I would go and just hang out there, and I was talking to them, and I asked them, what do you do with all this fabric that you're buying? Beautiful, beautiful fabric. What do you do with this fabric? And she's like, oh, I used to make things with it. Now I just buy it, and I put it in my closet, and every once in a while I take it out and touch it. And there was a man who was standing in the doorway, and he was wearing a baseball cap, and I couldn't really see his face, and we started talking, and I asked him where he was from, and one thing led to another, and he said, I had said I was from North Carolina. He said, I lived in Richmond, Virginia. I said, what's your name? He said, Rob Zwang. And I stood up, and I ran over to him, and I hugged him, and I started crying, and I held him, and I looked him in the eyes. I said, thank you. All these years I wanted to thank you, and I've never had the opportunity. I didn't know how to find you, but thank you, because it's because of you that I'm here. And so there was something about that very deep division between these identities that I was struggling with, the school identity and the youth group identity, and he really, really helped to manifest that and help make it possible for me. So my work as an artist is really what allowed me the space to start exploring a lot of these different questions. So this question of what if was always looming, because I was always looking for a doorway in, how could I find my space? What if I did this? What if that? What if this? And so things like I mentioned earlier, taking the mezuzah scroll out of this tiny container and carving it into a doorway to really understand what it means to pass through these gates. And again, I'm not going to go into the explanations of these particular works deeply. These are very object-oriented works that are really early works, but I wanted to show them to you to just get some understanding of the journey. And so this is just to show you this idea of the sphirot, these sort of different mystical realms of being. And what for me was my way of trying to understand that, how it could move through those spaces by building this desert labyrinth that was culminated on the Jewish holiday in which we received the Torah. So we were able to move through this space. It was built out in the middle of the desert, and I somehow got a bunch of people to go out there and build it with me. And then other ones that we made that traveled around. And this is a very special rabbi, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be a blessing, who really was also, he was a doorway back to my Judaism for me, and he commissioned what's called a shiviti. It's a sort of used in prayer. It's usually like a very little thing or something that you read, and I sort of blew that up and created this mosaic at a Jewish meditation center. Or like coming to understand the prayer shawl in a very different way. Through the eyes of Reb Zalman, he had really talked about how we can think about when light is put through a prism and you can see all the different colors, and he connected them all to the Sfirot and to all these different mystical teachings, but I wasn't totally satisfied with the way the colors came out. So I started making these prayer shawls for people inspired by his work, and again, it was a doorway in for me. But then I needed more, and I started taking a deep interest in social practice work, and just like very, very briefly, social practice really moves away from object it's sort of breaking down this idea of an artist in their studio and producing work, and then emerging and hanging the artworks on the walls. So it's really working towards how do we build collaboration, how do we move out into the community, how is there interaction. I was really, really interested in always in working with people, and this started to become the way that I started moving through my work. And sometimes that was like going back in time and realizing, oh yeah, this thing that I was doing, this is how I see it in that context. Just a breather. In case there's a question, or just like, because we're just gonna shift now into the more recent work. That was all very old work by way of introduction. And I'm not reading my notes at all. Which is fine. So I've been thinking a lot recently about the arc of my work in the context of erasure and this sort of reinsertion, and in this particular case of this work, I'm going to show you what I call this sort of textual re-embodiment. Like how does this female body come back to the text as a woman in a way in which I was pushed away from it for so long? What are the different pathways that I can find to get in there, and what's calling me? And where are those places that this erasure is happening, and what are the different ways that I'm playing with this idea of erasure, both in a literal way and in a much more conceptual way. So I want to start with the first erasure, the first Jewish erasure. You'll appreciate this, Ellen, because you actually brought this up yesterday. So the most ancient biblical account of the creation relates that God created the first man and the first woman at the same time. And Jewish legends tell us that this woman was Lilith. And Lilith, we learn, felt herself to be Adam's equal. We are both from the earth. But Adam refused to accept her equality, and Lilith, determined to retain her independence and dignity, and choosing loneliness over subservience, flew away from Adam in the Garden of Eden, and was later basically erased from the stories that get passed down to generation after generation. Another ending was when God denied this equality, she proceeded to kill hers and Adam's children. Okay, these are all stories that have gotten told because she's been demonized. So this got Lilith kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and she turned to the dark side and went on to give birth to countless numbers of demons. This is basically like urban legend of how people understand this figure of Lilith to be. And these are the ways in which Lilith is represented. Mostly in a sort of satanic or demonic fashion. And so she, like I said, was completely erased from the narrative and demonized. So just to share a little bit of my own experience, these are the places, some of the places, this is not a complete list, where I feel like from my own lived experience as a Jewish woman, where I've experienced erasure. And that would be from the Torah and the Talmud. I'm not going to read through the whole list. Jewish weddings, where women are often silenced or not given equal not always given equal grounding in the way that the vows are exchanged. In our wedding, in Israel, we had a woman perform the wedding, and there were many of our friends who did not come to the wedding because a woman was doing the ceremony. Billboards in Jerusalem, Jewish prayer, Jewish neighborhoods, even like where I don't belong in those particular places. Meals where I felt erased because I have certain needs around my Jewish practices, and in my own family in lots of different ways. And that's an ongoing thing with my family, trying to understand what it means for me to have this particular relationship to Judaism in the way that I do. And then there's the erasure, and then on top of that, sort of intersecting, there's like this need to understand, well, what's sort of been the erasure of women in the art world, because these are the two worlds that I'm existing in. This is a fabulous piece that was created by the Guerrilla Girls about the advantages of being a woman artist, which some of you may have seen. So some of the advantages are, for instance, working without the pressure of success, seeing your ideas live on in the work of others, not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits, being included in revised versions of art history, and so on. And so this is sort of what we're contending with. And then there's the place in which these are coming together for me. And it's sort of situated in this understanding and unfolding of Jewish feminism and Jewish feminist theology. Like Jewish religiosity as a whole, Jewish feminism is praxis-oriented. It's like how we are moving through the world, the things we're doing, the way we're practicing. Its goal is to move Jewish religious law, history, practice, and communal institutions in the direction of the full inclusion of women. Thus, feminist theological reflection is often embedded in ritual, liturgy, fiction, and historical research, textual interpretation, and midrash. And that is that intersection between my art and my Jewish self. It's sort of finding through those particular places, through the liturgy, through the ritual practice, through these ritual objects, through durational performance. That's how I'm finding my way and getting into that place. So this first piece that I want to talk about is called Anonymous Was a Woman. And it's a durational performance of gendered textual encounter. It's my work and experience of being a Torah scribe over this duration of writing. So from 2006 to 2010, and then again a second scroll from 2013 to 2015. And just to give a little bit of background, I think it's important to understand the Torah scroll is the most sacred text of the Jewish people. I mean, it's the most sacred ritual object of the Jewish people, I would dare to say. And it takes a scribe about 1.5 years minimum to write it. It's only ever been written by men until about 12 years ago when I started writing. And it's usually written by one very religious man. Even like a non-religious man to be writing a Torah scroll is kind of heretical still. And so that's just to set the background a little bit just to understand what it is. And I actually think a lot about it. I've been thinking a lot about, there's an artist in Portland, Sarah Seastrom, who's really introduced me to this idea of where each of us from our own ancestry can reach back into the indigenous art of our own people, that indigeneity in terms of craft and art making touches down in every culture. And I had this moment where and it was something like I desperately wanted to have in my life, like to understand, like what is the indigenous work of the Jewish people? And everyone was like, isn't it writing a Torah scroll? And I was like, oh my God, yeah, it's a Torah. I was so deep in it that I couldn't even see that what I was doing was actually completely engaging in that work and really like touching into this place. So I've been thinking a lot about what it means to exist in that space, and about the Torah scroll as this like very indigenous piece of an unbroken tradition. I would say the only other thing I can think of is the shofar, which is the ram's horn that we blow at this time of year. But I still think the Torah scroll it's a little bit more complex, let's say. And so this is one completely unfurled. You can kind of get a sense of how large it is. And so just to give you a background, a Torah scroll, and I'll just read this, and I have a question, which is, this is basically a Talmudic text that says why, it's laying the grounds for who can write and who can't write. And it's much less a question about who can and can't, but more of a question of what do you do with a scroll that was a scroll or tefillin or mezuzot, that a heretic, a masor, a traitor, an idol worshiper, a slave, a non-Jewish slave, a woman, a minor, a kuti, a non-Jew, or one who's perhaps feigned their conversion and can't be trusted, or a Jewish mumar, they're invalid. And I'm not going to go in right now to all of the reasons why, but let's just say that this is the basic text that has kept women out of this. So my question to you is, what do you notice about that list when you look at who those people are? Anyone? Yeah.
They seem to be people who do not have much power in society culture.
Yeah, there definitely generally exist in the list of people who don't move through the world with privilege. And yes.
All of them, the only exception is the woman, like she's just everybody else
An action or something. Oh, that's interesting. Yes. And so, what is the result of that? I've asked this question so many times. So, what is that result? What's the result? Yes, and.
It seems like she's not really Jewish because everyone else is not really Jewish. And the problem with all of that is that their Judaism is not to be trusted.
Also very interesting. I've never heard that response before. I mean, I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, and what I think about in this is that a woman's the only one who can't change her status in that list. Everybody else can change their status, including the mumar. Because if you go back and look at some of the text, there has been permission. There's permission that's given, and I actually spoke with an Orthodox rabbi recently about that to clarify that. So a woman, of course, today we can talk about sex change and transgender, but in these times and the way in which it's been carried forth, the woman was the only one in this place who couldn't change her status in society. So I wondered, well, what would happen if a woman wrote? And I'm just going to show you a short film about the answer to that. And I'm about 8.5 months pregnant with my son in this film, this little thing.
This is revolutionary. It's amazing. We're just a little community, and we made history.
Seattle, Washington.
Today we celebrate the completion of the Women's Torah, the first Sefer Torah created and embellished by an international community of women.
Kedem doesn't have its own Torah, and about 10 years ago, we decided that we wanted to buy one. And we looked on eBay, and we looked different places to find one, and then our rabbinic director at the time suggested that we commission the first Torah to be scribed by a woman, and we thought, what? Yeah, okay, that hasn't been done before. We realized after a while, it took a while, but realized that the reason there hadn't been any women scribed Torahs is that there were no women Torah scribes.
In the Talmud, it's forbidden for women to write. That's where it starts, and that's where we get the source of women, slaves, minors, heretics, non-Jews. The list is really interesting to me because everybody else in that list can change their status. A non-Jew can convert, a heretic can come back, a child grows up and becomes, and is no longer a minor. A slave can be freed, but a woman can't change her status. If you follow the historical development or discussions around the halakha, you see that the question came up a lot, but the minority opinions were dismissed. There was a minority opinion that gave permission to women to write.
I think it's so deeply meaningful that women who have not been permitted to read from the Torah have made the Torah.
Shoshana wrote there in Jerusalem. I wrote that part in Brazil.
Brazil, all right.
So Linda wrote in New York.
I was just a little thing part of it, and those last 3 days, we are just putting all the parts together, and it's like part of me, myself, as a person, as a Jewish history. For me, it's a big moment.
It's considered that if you write one letter, it is as if you had written the entire Sefer Torah. In order to allow as many people as possible to take part in this, we leave the last 2 lines blank so that people can fill them in.
That last panel has everybody in it, which is a fabulous thing. And I think that's such a wonderful statement about how women do things and the collaboration. It's just fantastic.
Actually, the most meaningful part was poking a hole through 2 of the pages. And as I'm working with this sharp thing, I'm thinking in my mind, I'm going to rip it. I'm going to rip the page. Oh my God. And then I thought, no, I won't damage it. I won't hurt it. It'll be fine. And I realized a few minutes later that I think that's so symbolic that women have felt like they're going to hurt it if they do it or work with it. And we're not going to hurt anything. We're going to make it better.
When we started, I got hate mail, and now I hear from people who are honored to be associated with the Women's Torah Project. When we started, we just wanted our own Torah. As we finish, we are the change that we want to see in the world.
So that was the making of the very first Torah scroll that was written by women. I was contacted in Jerusalem by this community in Seattle. I had been struggling for like 10 years to find a teacher. It's a very long story of how I had been living in Israel, became fascinated by this, wanted to write, couldn't find a teacher, went back to look for a teacher, came back to the States, and then finally just moved to Israel in 2000, and somehow very quickly came across a teacher who, it was secret. I couldn't talk about the training that we were doing together. I couldn't share his name. I didn't tell the people in the area where I was living that what I was doing, because I was afraid for the safety of my family, for myself and my family. And when they came to me about scribing, like I said, it's usually a Torah scroll is written by one person. But again, in this like way of really wanting to move towards collaboration, I was really, really interested in what it might look like, because I wasn't interested in being. My primary thing, like I was completely obsessed with the Torah and with the content and with wanting to write and the beauty of this object. But really what I wanted was to break open that space for women, so that I said, I will write this scroll for you, but my condition is that if there are any other women, because I knew that there was something bubbling up, if any other women come forward and they are properly trained and we feel that they can do this, we will invite them to write. And so ultimately we were 6 women from 3 different continents who wrote that scroll together. And I actually just met it for the first time this summer when that was finished in 2010. And I got to meet that scroll this summer in Portland, which was really exciting. And so a lot of this is really sort of playing with this idea of where we in this female body step into this very male space, and actually how and this is why I think a lot about it as performance, like the performance of the work looks very, very similar. The only thing really that changes is the body that's there in that space. And so just been thinking a lot about how we engender that space in a different way, and what that means for us. And you can see how, if you look at this, like, this is sort of the classic, when people often come to mind with this very religious man, the long payas, and hunched over and writing, and here's Julie doing that very same thing at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. And me too, in this assuming this very, very similar position. But when a woman is stepping into that space, we're bringing there's a whole nother layer of dialogue that is happening. And that's the place that I'm really interested in. And what it also makes space for are these spiritual protocols. Like, how do we as women, what does it mean about the way that we come to it? Can we create spiritual protocols for the way that we come to this work? Is that meaningful? Does it matter? How much do we feel like while we're adhering to all of the halachic, all of the Jewish law parameters, there's space for us, that white space, for us to really open it up in a different way. And so this is what the scribes look like. This is our second Torah scroll, different women. And so this is what Torah scribes look like today, which is really nice. And the other piece of it is that another sort of layer, and I'll use the word subversion because it's sort of something that comes up in my work quite a bit, but I would say, okay, what if we write this scroll, and then in the heart of Jerusalem, we open it up and invite the Jerusalem community to come and bind the scroll together, half of it, and then we'll send it to Toronto, and then we'll bring it with us to Toronto, and then we'll finish binding it there with their community. So we created this large event, and we invited our teacher to come, and people came to bind. Lots of women, because most Jewish people never have this kind of contact with the Torah scroll. It's been like this, it's like this very closed, reserved thing. And a lot of women and a lot of men, there's this myth that a woman can't touch a Torah scroll because she'll make it what's called tamei. She'll make it, for lack of a better word, impure. But it's not true, it can't happen. Torah school can't change its status like that. And so some people came because they just wanted to see what was going to happen, but they would never touch the scroll. They just wanted to understand what was happening there. And this is my teacher, Dove, who is still my mentor. And I hope I have the text here, yeah. And this is the letter that Dove wrote to me. This is my certificate. And just to get an understanding of how this goes, it basically says, I have practiced craft of writing stam in the Ashkenazi tradition. Shoshana is well qualified to write all of the letters according to all the halachic demands of the proper shapes of the letters. Shoshana is also well versed in the halachot that govern writing in a more general manner, and then he adds a little bit there. I must add, as an Orthodox Jew, that my understanding of the halacha invalidates the Sefer Torah or mezuzah or tefillin from being a text kosher for mitzvah purpose if written by a woman or a man who is not Torah observant. For this point of departure, Shoshana understands she takes full responsibility. Ellen, you're making a terrible face.
It's just so interesting.
It's very, yes. And what's amazing about it is that since 2000, he has been my mentor. He checks the Torah scrolls that I write. We have agreed to disagree. We've started to speak in public together. We can share a public space. He's a person that I go, what's so amazing about him is that he was willing to do this. And he's still willing to exist in that space and to maintain his integrity of what he believes. And so we can meet in that space. And it's been very, very special. And this is us at a show that I had in Jerusalem having a public conversation with another Torah scribe who at the time was also living, Julie, who you saw earlier, also living there, part of the Jerusalem Biennale. Okay. And just a little bit on the idea of anonymity. The reason that I'm playing with this idea of anonymity, that we know Anonymous was a woman from Virginia Woolf. In this case, a Torah scroll is never signed. We never know who actually wrote it. And here we're sort of playing with these different ideas of, well, what does it mean to do we keep it anonymous? Do we mark it either out of respect for the Orthodox community that would feel uncomfortable if they ever got their hands on it, knowing that it had been written by a woman, or do we deliberately not mark it, or do we deliberately mark it also so that someone who is out there looking for a Torah scroll that's written by a woman will know? To this date, nobody has marked them. We still play with, we still follow the tradition of not marking it. Maybe we thought to emboss it or whatnot. So they're still all unmarked. And most Torah scrolls do get out of the hands, and we don't, of the people who commissioned it, so we don't know. It's creating a larger conversation in the community, and that's exciting. And so in this case, Anonymous actually is a woman. And this is my daughter, Hadar, and it's always really amazing for me to see her pick up a quill and write without thinking twice about it. It's her territory, and she belongs in that space, and she knows that she has full access to this because we've paved that way. Okay, does anyone have any questions that are just burning? No? Are you oversaturated yet? Okay. So just a little bit on sort of this idea of revisioning the narrative. So out of that, I just want to say that the artist Helene Elon has, for many, many, many years, been an inspiration to me and has really informed my work. She did this, she's grew up very, very religious, is still religious, but left that home and that lifestyle. And all of her work, almost all of her work, is sort of centered in finding her way still at 85 years old, really bumping up against these different places where women are erased and women are kept out, or where all kinds of things. So for her, a very a turning point piece was The Liberation of God, where she went through the entire Torah in a book manuscript and highlighted in pink all of the misogynistic passages. And that was like a very, very important piece for the Jewish feminist community and the Jewish community at large and the art community. And one of the questions that my teacher, who is no longer with us, Bana Dvorah Haberman, consistently asked is how do we come home to the text? What are the different ways that we can come home to the text? And so that is a lot of where I'm exploring. And so in this piece, Women of the Book, which really grew out of this very intimate experience of, writing a Torah scroll is very, very different than doing a weekly Torah study. There's a tradition of studying the different weekly Torah portion, but when you're so deeply engaged in the writing of it, there's a very different experience that emerges in a very different relationship to the text. Even though the text is the same, you can't change anything about it. It has to be copied word for word with all the letters shaped exactly the way they need to be, and it gets checked, and nothing can change. And that presented suddenly, it had always been challenging, but in that way it presented a big challenge for me. And I started to wonder, what would it look like if Jewish women were taking the Torah portion and interpreting it in visual language? And so I started to curate this project called Women of the Book, which was ultimately shown in the Jerusalem Biennale in 2015. There are 54 different Jewish women artists from all over the world, from 12 different countries, across the religious spectrum, who chose a Torah portion and created it on parchment. And then it's bound together like a Torah scroll. So the whole idea is that it's mirroring the written Torah scroll and this Women of the Book visual scroll are mirroring one another, created on the same material and using a very different language to get to the same place, but going into that white space and creating this visual material. And I'm just so obviously I only selected a few pieces, but you can get a sense this is a Korean woman who's an artist, and a Belgian artist, Israeli artist, and all so very different. And the pieces are on the same, they're like the same size as a Torah scroll. American-based artist, US-based artist, Israeli woman who became religious. Also Barbara has become religious, already had become religious when she did this work. Had lived on a commune for a long time, which might be visible in some of that work. Comic, some graphic artist work, and an Indian artist. This is a very, very beautiful, diverse group of women. It was curated over like 10 years. It took a long time to do it. And it was a really, really important piece for me to do, again, to like go in and find my story in that and the voices of other women. And then we, did all kinds of programming and conversation around that, and learning in the space, and dance workshops, and all kinds of different workshops related to text and women. And so I just want to touch down on some of the other places where this question of erasure and reinsertion is being addressed through this lens, this Jewish feminist lens. And one of those places is in really looking at Wikipedia. And so there has been a movement of writing women into, and one of the reasons that, it just sort of spirals in on itself, but women in general, and women artists are very, very underrepresented anyway in galleries. But then again, because they're not in galleries, their work's not being written about, they're represented less in galleries, and in museums, and their work's not written about as much, so they don't appear as much in Wikipedia. So I've been really thinking about representation and how we can sort of change that representation, and just really honing in on Jewish women artists. And so I've partnered with the Oregon Jewish Museum, and we've been doing Wikipedia edit-a-thons to enter Jewish women artists into the Wikipedia canon. And so we get together on International Women's Day, and we have these Wikipedia edit-a-thons, and then some people go on and continue doing these entries. In fact, someone just called me and said, I just finished the entry I started a year and a half ago. So, and we had people sort of Skyping into that process from all up and down the West Coast. And then I've also really been thinking, again, going back to this idea of the Jewess and that kind of language in this day and age when we're really sort of breaking down those binaries, but what it might look like to reinterpret the way that my grandmother was thinking about the way in which she was naming herself as a Jewess at that time. For her was really about, like I said, about her kind of assimilation and sort of moving away from her identity as a Jewish woman. And Jewess was like a kind of a tame word that gave her some distancing. So what might that look like if Jewish women reclaimed that word in the way that Lilith has been reclaimed and has become a magazine, a journal that's a very important journal. And so I've been thinking a lot about, or even Bitch magazine, like just thinking about how we women can reclaim that. And so there was this publication called The American Jewess, that was started. It only was around for like four to 6 years. It was at the turn of the century, in the late 1800s. And I went out to Brandeis University to research this journal because I'm really interested in how we can reclaim this name of Jewess and republish and re-release this American Jewess journal from a contemporary perspective. And so I went out and talked to some different folks about, different leaders in the Jewish community about how they feel about this idea of Jewess.
I forget in the books, possibly George Eliot, descriptions of Jewesses, you always knew that if it was a Jewess, then she had dark hair and a prominent nose, and she probably was from Sephardic heritage. But I sort of want to, while you're asking me this, I want to embrace it because it's part of our shared heritage.
Jewess, what does it mean to you?
It was a very 19th century Americana feel to it to me.
Can it be redeemed?
Jewish? I'm not that interested in redeeming it. I'm curious about why someone would want to. I think the questions in that would be like, is it advantageous to have a gendered way to identify as Jewish in this moment when categories of gender are fluid and in flux, but also still important to a lot of people? And yet being a Jewish feminist is very important to me. And a piece of that is being a Jewish woman. So, Jewess. I can play with it.
What's a Jewess? It feels like an anachronistic, kind of misogynistic, reference to a Jewish woman.
Jewess. Yeah.
I think of like Esther, Queen Esther, like a Jewess in my mind. She seems to me she seems like she's owns herself. Owns herself? I don't know, that's not what I'm trying to say. She's a fully empowered person.
It's like a sort of sexualized asexual being. It's in a dusty museum, like in eastern Poland, and they have like a sort of wax mannequin with like some sort of Cleopatra Halloween costume-esque kind of fittings, and it says Jewish, circa 1897.
Yeah, so I have never used the word Jewess in my life. When I hear it, I guess I think of a Jewish woman, but there's like a certain connotation, it's like maybe more like fluid and like flowy and like Jewess. Maybe like youthful, I would say. It conveys a sense of youthfulness. I have no idea where that's coming from though. That's just like a Kishkitz response.
Jew-S.
Yeah.
It sounds like Jew-ish. It's like, how Jewish are you? I'm Jew-ish. Are you? I thought Jew was gender neutral. That Jew-S sounds like it's a extra feminine Shekhinah suffix. If someone's trying to reclaim something, I'd be curious to hear what they're trying to reclaim.
Right, it sounds a little archaic to my ear. I very rarely hear women today described as Jewesses. We're all Jews. I think it's sort of like stewardess. It definitely brought up an older sense of feminine imagery from the shtetl with the babushka and the long flowing skirts. So definitely think there's a case for redemption for all kinds of words that may be considered out of fashion or even derogatory, like a reclamation of the past in a positive way. Right? I don't know if I would be anxious to get on board with that one, but hey, if we're gonna have bling Jewish necklaces, Jewess necklaces, I would definitely sign up for one.
Great. So I was really, really interested in how we can look at that language, and for me, in a way, it's like reinserting my body and this Jewish female into a male-dominated Jewish space and a Christian-dominated white space. So like really sort of playing with this term of how what it would look like to move through the world with that kind of languaging attached to who I am or claiming that languaging as a Jewish woman. And then just quickly, this piece is I've been going through the text of the Old Testament and really literally doing this erasure and going through and erasing the text so that a new narrative can emerge. So again, playing with the erasure in a different kind of way that's been, creating a new story. And all of these are just examples, like I said earlier, of this different way of working with erasure. And here, also with the idea of what happens with the story of the golem, who is created to protect the Jewish people and has the word emet, the word truth, written on his forehead. And the only way when he becomes full of his own power and his own control, the only way to kill him, to get rid of him, is to erase the aleph, the first letter. And so that piece was created shortly after the election. And then just very briefly, this is a piece that I'm working on, which is bringing the conversation of ovulation and fertility into public space. It's a 22-foot scroll of 4.5 years of my ovulation charts that are being created into they're run through this music maker, and then are creating a composition based on the different notes where the markers on the chart fall, and it's a tribute to my children. But also bringing this conversation out into the public space is a whole series of work I've been creating around that. Okay, how are you guys doing? Yes.
I have a little comment about Jewess.
Yeah.
I have never heard the term before.
Yeah.
To me, that's a very negative and anti-Semitic tone to it, only because of the context. In the mid to late 80s, I moved to Greensboro, went to Capitol Hill to visit our fathers and assemblies, which we do very often. I live in the context of APEC. But we visited our representatives, one of whom was the infamous Jesse Mellon, and he used that term when he met us. He said, I'm here amongst Jews and Jewesses. And that's the first time I had ever heard
It made you cringe. Yeah.
I still don't hear the term.
Yeah.
I think just the way it's said.
Yeah.
It's Jewish. Look at the grin.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think about Bitch Magazine and like how that also makes, that languaging makes people cringe, but it doesn't have the layer over it of what you were saying about anti-Semitism and the way that you sort of received it in that way. So it's interesting to hear that and to think about it in that way. Yeah, thanks. This is work that Ellen mentioned very briefly. I'm not going to go very deeply into it because it's like opens up a whole thing, and I want to have time for us to really talk about the Contemporary Jewish Museum. And all of this is really to set a context so that all of us together can understand how this work, where this kind of work is emerging, from where it's emerging. But I'm going to just touch on it very briefly. And I've been really interested in, I'm very, very interested in object. Very often in social practice, there's not object that's sort of at the center of it, but for me, especially like around writing a Torah scroll, which I'm the only one of the Torah scribes who's really sort of thinking about writing Torah in a contemporary art framework. And I think it's really, really important. And so that sort of led me out to think about material because it's so material oriented, even though I'm also thinking about it as performative work. And so I've, over the years, have been really, really interested in the material of the making and also in sacred objects. And what I have discovered through a relationship that I've built with parchment makers, very, very, very Haredi Orthodox parchment makers who lived very, very close, coincidentally. I don't really like that word because it's not really a coincidence. There's just some important reason that we happen to live so close to each other, or their facility was so close. And I spent a lot of time there developing relationships with them, the only woman ever in that space, and also the only woman ever in the space in Jerusalem going in to buy the material to actually write the Torah scroll, which started out, and by the way, Elliot Ginsberg, who is Ellen's mentor and advisor and who she studied with in Michigan, went in and bought the materials for me when I first started, because but there was like this discomfort about being deceitful about what we were doing, but there was also always the possibility that no one would ever sell the material to us. There emerged over time this one particular family, the Bach family, that would agree to sell us the material, and it was a don't ask, don't tell kind of situation. They know what we're doing. And in a way, like Dove, my teacher, they understand that it's okay to sell us the material. That if they don't ask us what we're doing with it, then they can sell it to us. There's nothing forbidding them to sell us the material. Some people might, some of their teachers, or there might be rabbis who disagree with that, but they sell us the material, and their facility was very nearby. What I have discovered over time is the way in which the parchment is made and where it is sourced. And it's very, very disturbing to me, and I've been working, it's basically coming from this industrial animal complex. And so I've really been questioning, how do we think about sacred material, particularly in the context of ritual use, when the material is sourced from practices that are extremely inhumane. And so I've been bringing the Jewish community to task on that, and I've partnered, and so basically it's fetal cows that the skin is sourced from fetuses who are raised in this industrial animal complex. And so I've been asking, how does the Jewish community reconcile the inhumane treatment of the animals upon whose backs we are literally writing, creating our most sanctified ritual objects? How do we reconcile that with the sacred text inscribed on those skins? And I've partnered with a local shochet, a ritual slaughterer, and I've been working with them, and I've been sourcing the skins that I now use and that I provide for other people from the skins of animals that are raised in backyards and whatnot. And we've gotten support from the Regional Arts Council in Oregon, and we're creating a publication that is there's a graphic arts publication. This is one of the finished Megillah, finished scroll that was written on that parchment, and this is a piece that's being sewn into a Torah scroll. And I'm not showing you all of the very graphic material that I often show other audiences, just because I want to stay focused here. And so working with this graphic artist, and we're developing this publication. And the reason that I just wanted to touch down on that is because that question about sacred material is really, like, when Ellen asked me to come out here, and she was like, so what are you thinking about? Like, what's on your mind? And we talked about a couple different things. And I shared with her about this project and how I've really just been thinking about that sort of liminal moment that we don't really have a way to mark it. I mean, we can sort of mark it in time and space, because it's really that moment that an object, when it transfers from being mundane to being sacred, is really because of the human intervention, right? So it gets activated by the humans in all of these different ritual ways, or because we imbue it with significance, and then suddenly it's not a mundane thing, like the shirt I'm wearing becomes, because I don't know, wore it, maybe I wore it at my son's Brit Milah, and then it's always for me like this very special thing. Now, I haven't necessarily created an intention to say that. I've just decided that it's this sacred object. And I'm not saying that there's some kind of need for all of these things for us to go back and think about how they're made and whatnot. I just wanted to point out that in that particular project, that's a very, very important piece for me. And now it's sort of moving into this project that I'm bringing to the community. And so it's really, really soliciting these stories of significance, of where an object rests in its significance. And I'm going to say more about that because it's a lot more than that. And I just want to, point out that, I mean, I'm including this piece because, and this has partially to do with the ancestral story and the story of coming back to North Carolina. I acquired this cup 3 days ago from my father, and it has been in our family since 1790. It's the only ritual Jewish object in our family. And it gets passed down traditionally to the oldest male in the family, and I have 2 brothers, an older brother, and so I can hold on to it for a little while. But like, we made sure that it was brought over to Israel when we got married, and we like had it with us under our wedding canopy, under the chuppah. It was very, very, very important, and we're the only people in our family that actually use it. Well, now we'll get to use it, but it just has been sitting collecting dust for years and years and years and years. And so it's like imbued with a huge, I mean, on one hand, it's like an obvious object because it's a Kiddush cup, and almost every Jewish home that celebrates Shabbat has a Kiddush cup somewhere in their house, and even homes that don't often. But it's really exciting for me and special, and sort of part of this whole journey of coming back to North Carolina, and shocking that my father actually handed it over and said, you have more use for this than I do. So, and it's amazing because it has inscribed on it every single person who's gotten married in the family. So the entire lineage of the family and the year that they got married and who they married is on that cup. And then there's a plate that goes underneath it that we added to it once it was full. And so during the time that I've been here so far, I've been talking to different folks and asking them this question that we're going to get to ask ourselves tonight about something that is significant, an object that is significant to you as a Jewish person. And then this was a piece that that is representing the series of Tupperware containers, because there was a woman in the community who was a survivor of cancer, and she was receiving food delivered in these Tupperwares. And a photograph of a painting that was a very significant painting to Susan Siegel and her. It was like this Rebbe that she would talk to when she was growing up, and then she finally, it was promised to her, and now she has it in her home, and it has this like very deep childhood significance to her. And that was a little bit jumping ahead, and now I'm gonna move back a little bit just to like focus out and sort of talk about this idea, because what we wanted to do tonight was like, I wanted to give you have this artist talk and introduce you to my work so that we could set the context for where this project that I've been invited here to do is going. And so, actually I don't want you to read that yet. So I just want to read something from, so I've been working with Ellen's Jewish and Gender Studies class and Adam's Introduction to Social Practice class, two very, very, very different groups of people, which is really interesting. And at the core of this project is they're given this assignment, and the assignment is to go out into the community, into the Jewish community, to people who identify as Jewish, and to ask them to talk about a personal object that is imbued with significance to them as a Jew. That's the assignment. And this assignment will then become this contemporary Jewish museum. And those objects, both in the traditional way that we think about objects and perhaps expanding past the way that we traditionally think about objects, will exist in that museum space, and then we'll have a later life in this pop-up museum, and then we'll have a later life in this catalog, so that they can have more expanded audience. And so it's been like a challenge in many different ways. And one of the challenges is how do you work with a group of people, of students who are not Jewish? There's, I think, one person who's Jewish, who's here tonight, in those two classes. How do you do that, send students who are not Jewish out into a cultural context that they're very unfamiliar with, which anthropologists and ethnographers do that, but with a lot more research under their belt and preparation. And how do you introduce people to this way of thinking about art making, like on one foot, in a way in which they'll be able to understand why they're doing what they're doing and what we're going about, and how can the community also get on board. And so we've been reading some different articles, and I think it's important to understand that the students are reading about, there's a very important art critic in the Jewish community named Edward Rothstein, and he wrote an article that was responded to by many, many different people, different essays that then were written as a result of that, that is about the problem with Jewish museums. And so the students have been reading, and we've had conversations about that, and they're also looking at the work of Harold Fletcher and a couple other artists that he works with, who happens to also be the director of the MFA program that I'm just finishing. And his way of thinking, their way, and also very much Harold's way, of thinking about museum in an expanded way, so that a museum can exist in all kinds of different ways, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And learning a little bit about the Jewish history of Greensboro, and being introduced to some writings on anti-Jewish oppression, because it's very, very hard. And also there's like a really interesting intersection between the argument that Rothstein is making about why Jewish museums are failing and what the problem is, and that primarily is that there's this this like fear, perhaps, of being too Jewish in the Jewish museum, or of only focusing on the genocide that the Jewish people face of the Holocaust and including so much other material from other people. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but I want to point out one of the things that, that he said. He says, nothing, it seems, will shatter the traditional Jewish museum's paltry view of Judaism, Jewish history, and Jewish public responsibility. Minimize your profile, mute your pride, be overly indulgent, even perversely so, of the tastes, priorities of the surrounding culture, resist any hint of difficult scholarship or religious thought, avoid any sort of self-assertion that might infringe the dictates of political correctness or intellectual fashion. These are the defining characters of the modern Jewish Identity Museum. There's a lot to say about that and a lot to argue about that, but that's what he's saying, and there's a lot of truth in that. And then he finishes the article, and this is what sort of propelled this project. He says, as for those who insist on holding out for a more rooted and substantive view of Jewish identity, they'll have to rely on the small handful of exceptions or start to think about what it would be like to create a new Jewish museum in the first third of the 21st century. And that last sentence of that article was my charge. And I was like, oh, well, let's do that. And so when Ellen asked me and invited me to, it was hard to say no, particularly because of this relation, because you're here and we're here in North Carolina, and because of my relationship to this place, this sort of coming home to this space, having taken this enormous journey and being able to bring all of that perspective and all of that sort of ancestral research and my own unfolding of understanding who I am as a Jewish person into this project. And so, okay. And so what I want you to do is just to take a moment, because we want to spend a little bit of time just thinking about this. So what is it about the idea? Because we've been hearing all these things, all this like excitement about having a Jewish museum in Greensboro and what that might mean. And to me, it kind of means like there's something under the surface. And I'm just really curious to hear, I was going to have you guys like talk in groups, so maybe you can just share a little, well, let's see. I'm interested in knowing what is it that is exciting or curious or igniting your interest, or where you have apprehension or dissent about this whole idea. Curious to know where that resonates from you, because we've been hearing all kinds of different things. And actually, why don't you just turn to the person sitting next to you and share what is of interest to you, where the curiosity lies. Okay, I'm curious to hear just from a couple people what was shared. What were some of the things that came up for people? Anyone want to share? Don't be shy. Yes.
Being one of the students in the classes and having very little prior knowledge to Judaism, I'm really interested in the pointedness of the topic that you were discussing, the liminality, and that where does an object and the almost seemingly everyday mundane or profane object, where does it become sacred?
Yeah.
And I also said in our group, I didn't realize this the other night in class. I hinted at it, but I think it's interesting that you are having an insider group give objects that are being curated, and the stories are curated by an outsider to a certain degree.
Right. So I'm going to actually argue that last point, which is that, and this is something we were talking about, and this is just like, you know, because what I haven't laid is sort of the foundation, the contextual foundation of social practice. And just to say very briefly, like the people who are giving the objects are actually the curators. They're curating this. I mean, in a way, because you're choosing to go to someone, to a particular person, but people are volunteering to be interviewees. But the objects that they give, and this is the magic of it, is that it's a way to have the community come out and collaborate on this so that there's shared ownership by sharing the curatorial practice in an unusual way.
I still like the point that I am really getting at, though, regardless of how we want to use the language, at some point in the process, the outsider perspective is becoming concretely embedded into it. And it's interesting to see that. You know, you almost always have one or the other. You don't have both.
I have more questions for you, but I'm going to ask you privately because I want to hear from other people too, and I'm aware of the time. Anyone else? Yes, Alyssa.
So for me, it's really the contemporary aspect and the fact that an object like Tupperware would be part of it,
Yeah.
or picture that's on somebody's cell phone.
Yeah.
That just seems, you know, when I think of the Jewish Museum, I just think of like really old, you know, grave frames and things like that. And it just feels very new and exciting, and just find it impressive for that reason.
Great, that was perfect. That was like a planted answer. Not that any of the responses, there's anything wrong with them, but it's like that's really getting at, for me, like what's really interesting, because it's also coming out of the argument that Rothstein was saying, is that there's a way in which the museums feel deadened, because when you put these ritual objects on display, or basically the way you were just describing your experience, in this way we're really looking at it, what is keeping Judaism alive for different people in a totally unexpected and non-normative way. So it's a piece of Tupperware, or it's a picture on your cell phone, or it's so many different things, and that moves it out of this sort of antique, like sort of ancient, the language he would use, like morgue-like experience, and brings it into a really contemporary understanding of who we are as Jewish people and what that means to us, and how we make meaning out of our lives through the objects that we come into contact with, and how they are imbued with this significance and go through this transference from mundane to, I'm not going to use the word sacred, but from mundane to significance, let's say. Anyone else? We can talk after also. I had to include this picture because this is one of the things that makes it really interesting for me, because this is very close to where I'm staying, and I was walking into town and I saw this, and I thought, wow, okay, I'm in America, I'm in the South, and I wondered, would it ever be possible for there to be a sign in someone's front yard that said, "Thank you, Allah," or "Thank you, Hashem"? You know, or like, is that ever possible? And I don't think so. I've certainly never seen it, and I don't think that anybody from a different, a non-Christian world would ever put a sign out that indicates that they are praising their God. And so there's something very meaningful to me about bringing a contemporary Jewish museum into a context in which this is the dominant normative experience of the world, and overlaying and inserting this this museum in this kind of a space. And also to say that what was also really interesting for me, there is no Jewish museum anywhere in North Carolina, and there's only 2 others in all of the South. So it's fun to just sort of stand up and say, hey, we're going to make this museum, we're going to frame it, and we're going to call it a museum, which gives it a sort of, which is also playing with this idea of what a museum is, but it gives it, it brings up so many different questions, like, what does it take for a small city with a very small Jewish community to claim this kind of, how do we claim that kind of cultural agency? Do we have the legitimacy to do that? My answer is, yeah, of course we do. But not everybody sees it like that, and that's what makes it interesting as a contemporary art piece. What would be collected in this kind of museum? Can it be done without a capital campaign to make a building? And on that example, really, I'm reaching back into different models of contemporary art, where museums pop up in different places, on a university campus, in an elementary school, in my own home. We've established the Guggenheim Museum Portland because I'm a Guggenheim, and all my life, everywhere I go, people ask me, "Are you from the Guggenheim family?" And yeah, I am from the Guggenheim family, but I'm from my own Guggenheim family. And so really like playing with this idea of what is a museum and who can establish it. And then we get to ask the questions of what would be contained in that collection, what would that representation look like through the material object and other representation, what makes it unique. Things like this keychain trinket that set off a series of events leading this person, Brian, back to Judaism and ultimately to Israel, and the stories. So part of this project, it's not the objects alone are not enough, it's the stories that go with the objects, and that will be part of it too. And it's the immersion of these stories that helps each other in the Jewish community and also the outside community to understand what does it mean to be a Jewish person today. And this is one slice of life of what it means to be a Jewish person today and to move through the world in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so just for like a final piece, I just want you, we have like 5 more minutes. I want, if you identify as Jewish, if you can turn to your neighbor or someone else in the room and just share the very question that we're going to be asking. What is a personal object that is imbued with significance for you as a Jew? And if you do not identify as Jewish, what is a personal object that is imbued with significance for you within your own faith or spiritual practice or life journey? So, I'm sorry to interrupt your conversations because they look very lively. Thanks for sharing that with each other. So this is that little exercise is a mini version, or like just a little mini exercise of how we're going about this process. And so the students will be doing the interviews in the classes. The museum studies program is getting involved in taking and doing the outtake of the collection. I'll be doing interviews with different people, and we also invite anybody in the community to also, if you are interested, to engage in the interview process or in being an interviewee. And so in the back, if you follow Adam's moving body towards the back, there are sign-up sheets. If you're interested in being interviewed or in doing interviews or in both, please write your name and your email. And if you're just in general interested in the project and you want to be kept up to date, please leave your name and email well, your email for sure, and your phone number if you want to be contacted personally, which would also happen by email, of course. Anyway, please do that because we want I really, really want the Greensboro community to have ownership over this. And just like a small example of how that is happening, I had a conversation. I met with 4 of the leadership staff at B'nai Shalom, and they're so excited about the project that they decided that they would actually like to do this process with their entire school. And parallel to our museum, they're going to have a decentralized branch of the museum collection from their school families at the school. And they'll have a catalog, and some of those items will cross over into the Greensboro project space, where we'll have a physical gallery, but we'll also have other spaces, hopefully around town, that will also be like the decentralized part of the museum. So there's a lot of possibility and lots of ways that and so for me, it's really, really exciting when an idea is like really discussed and dissected and understood in different ways and then interpreted in different ways, and people make it their own. And that's what I'm really after, is as much collaboration and as much of the community really making it their own. This is my toolbox from my scribing, and I think this would be the object that I would put in the museum if I lived in Greensboro. And that's all. Thank you so much for coming out, and I hope we'll see you in this project.